The air hung heavy with dust and memories as Tess Thornton stood alone on the edge of Willow Creek, her silhouette framed against the fading sunset of 1879. She had buried her husband James 3 months ago, but the weight of his absence still pressed against her chest like the barrel of a gun. Willow Creek, Wyoming was a small but growing settlement caught between the dying ways of the frontier and the coming progress of the railroad. Tess had arrived there 4 years earlier with James, full of dreams about their ranch and the family they would build. Now at 26, she was alone with nothing but a small cabin, dwindling supplies, and a heart that refused to believe he was truly gone. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see a rider approaching, his figure becoming clearer as he drew near. Logan McKenzie sat tall in his saddle, the last golden rays of sunlight catching on his weathered hat. At 32, he had the kind of face that told stories without speaking, hardened by sun and wind, but with eyes that held a warmth that belied his rugged appearance. "Evening, Mrs. Thornton," he said, tipping his hat respectfully as he reined his horse to a stop. "Saw you standing out here alone. Everything all right?" Tess wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Just thinking, Mr. McKenzie, sometimes the cabin walls close in too tight." Logan nodded, understanding in his eyes. He had come to Willow Creek 3 weeks ago, taking work at the livery stable while passing through. At least, that's what he'd said. But 3 weeks had stretched longer than anyone expected, and Tess had noticed how his gaze followed her at church or when she came to town for supplies. "I was heading back from checking the Henderson place," Logan said. "They're still looking to sell before winter sets in, I heard." Tess looked back toward the creek. "James and I used to talk about buying that land someday, expanding our little place." She gave a small, sad smile. "Dreams change, I suppose." Logan dismounted, leading his horse closer. "Mrs. Thornton, please call me Tess, Mrs. Thornton makes me feel like I'm wearing someone else's clothes." He nodded. "Tess then, I don't mean to pry, but folks in town are worried about you. Winter's coming and that cabin needs work before the snow flies." "I can manage," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I'm sure you can," Logan replied, "but sometimes accepting help isn't about ability, it's about practicality." Tess looked at him directly then, studying the sincerity in his face. "Are you offering to help, Mr. McKenzie?" "Logan," he corrected with a small smile. "And yes, I am." No strings attached, just neighborly assistance. Something in his voice made her pause. There was no pity there, only genuine concern. For the first time in months, Tess felt a flicker of something other than grief. "I'll think about it," she said finally. The next morning, Tess was surprised to hear knocking at her door. She opened it to find Logan standing there with tools and lumber loaded in a small wagon. "I thought about what you said last night," he explained, "about thinking about my offer. Figured I'd save you the trouble of finding me in town." Tess couldn't help but smile at his forthrightness. Most men would take "I'll think about it" as a polite refusal. "I've never been very good at taking hints," Logan replied with a shrug. "Besides, that roof won't fix itself, and those clouds on the horizon don't look friendly." Tess glanced up at the graying sky. The threat of early autumn storms had been worrying her more than she cared to admit. With a sigh that was part resignation and part relief, she stepped aside. "There's coffee on the stove if you'd like some before you start." Logan spent the day repairing her roof, working with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience. Tess found herself watching him from time to time as she went about her own chores. There was something comforting about the steady rhythm of his hammer, the way he worked without unnecessary talk. When the sun began to set, Tess invited him to stay for supper, a simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, but the best she could offer. "This is mighty fine cooking, Tess," Logan said appreciatively as he took a second helping. "James always said I made the best cornbread in 3 counties, she replied, then felt the familiar ache at speaking his name aloud. Logan noticed her expression change. "You must miss him something fierce," Tess nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she finally found her voice, the words came out barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wake up and forget he's gone, just for a moment, then I remember all over again. How long were you married?" 5 years. "We came out here from Missouri with big dreams and not much else." Tess poured more coffee into his cup. "What about you?" You have family somewhere. Logan shook his head. Not anymore, lost my parents young, been riding from place to place since I was 16. That sounds lonely. It can be, he admitted. But there's a freedom to it too. They talked until the fire burned low, sharing pieces of their lives without delving too deep. When Logan finally stood to leave, Tess felt a strange reluctance to see him go. I'll be back tomorrow to finish the repairs, he said at the door, if that's all right with you. Yes, she replied. That would be fine. True to his word, Logan returned the next day and the day after that. What had started as roof repairs expanded to fixing her corral fence, reinforcing the walls of her small barn, and a dozen other tasks that James had left unfinished when typhoid took him that summer. Each evening, Tess would invite Logan to stay for supper, and each night their conversations grew longer. She learned he had fought briefly in the closing days of the Civil War, despite being too young, had worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, and had even panned for gold in Colorado before drifting to Wyoming. For his part, Logan discovered Tess had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri, loved to read poetry by lamplight, and had dreams of someday reopening the abandoned schoolhouse in Willow Creek. Why haven't you? He asked one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the stars emerge. James needed help with the ranch, she said. And then, after I just haven't had the heart or the energy, I suppose. Logan was quiet for a moment. James sounds like he was a good man. He was, Tess agreed, feeling the familiar ache. Kind, hardworking. Full of dreams bigger than this little valley could hold. Is that why you stay? To keep his dreams alive? The question caught her off guard. I stay because this is my home now. Where else would I go? Logan didn't answer directly. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to put down roots. Stay in one place long enough to see an apple tree I planted bear fruit. It has its rewards, Tess said softly, and its sorrows. As October arrived, bringing with it colder nights and the first hints of frost, Tess found herself looking forward to Logan's daily visits with an eagerness that both comforted and disturbed her. The grief for James hadn't lessened, but it had somehow shifted, making room for new feelings she wasn't ready to name. One crisp afternoon, Logan arrived with a surprise, a small crate of books he'd purchased from a traveling salesman passing through town. They're not new, he apologized as Tess opened the crate with wonder, but the bookseller said they're in good condition. Tess ran her fingers over the spines: Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Tennyson, and several novels she'd longed to read. Logan, this is too much. I can't accept these. You mentioned your books were wearing out from reading them so often, he said simply. Consider it payment for all those suppers. That evening, after their meal, Tess read aloud from Tennyson's In Memoriam by the fire. Logan listened intently, his eyes rarely leaving her face as her voice gave life to the poet's words of loss and remembrance. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all," she finished softly, closing the book. "Do you believe that?" Logan asked. Tess considered the question carefully. "Most days, yes. Some days I'm not so sure. And today," she met his gaze across the small room. "Today, I think I do." As Tess prepared for bed that night, she found herself standing before the small daguerreotype of James that sat on her dresser. His young face looked back at her, frozen in time, his eyes holding the promise of a future they would never share. "I miss you," she whispered to the image, "but I'm so tired of being alone." The first heavy snow came in early November, blanketing the valley and isolating the small ranch even further. Logan had taken to staying in her barn on particularly cold nights, insisting it made more sense than riding back to town in dangerous weather. One such evening, as the wind howled around the cabin corners, Tess was startled by a knock at her door. She opened it to find Logan standing there, snow dusting his shoulders and hat. "Sorry to disturb you," he said, "but the temperature's dropping fast. I wanted to make sure your stove was holding up. Come in before you freeze," Tess urged, stepping aside. Once he was inside, she noticed he was carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. "What's that?" Logan unwrapped the package to reveal a beautiful hand-carved wooden box. "I've been working on this for a while. Thought you might like it for your letters and such." Tess took the box, running her fingers over the intricate carvings of wildflowers and vines. "Logan, this is beautiful. You made this." He nodded, a hint of color touching his cheekbones that had nothing to do with the cold. "My father was a carpenter before he turned to ranching, taught me a few things." "Thank you," she said, genuinely moved by the gift and the thought behind it. "Would you like some coffee to warm up?" As they sat by the fire, the wind outside grew fiercer, rattling the windows and sending occasional drafts through the cabin despite Logan's repairs. "Storm's worse than I expected," Logan observed. "I should head back to the barn before it gets any more difficult to navigate." Tess looked toward the window where snow was piling against the glass. "That's foolish. You'll freeze halfway there." She hesitated, then added, "You can take James's side of the bed. I'll sleep in the chair." "I'll take the chair," Logan insisted. "I've slept in worse places." They argued gently about it until Tess finally conceded, bringing him extra blankets and a pillow. As she prepared for bed, an odd feeling settled over her, not discomfort at having Logan in her home, but rather a strange sense that something important was shifting between them. In the middle of the night, Tess woke to find the fire had died down, leaving the cabin cold. She could see Logan in the chair, his tall frame awkwardly folded into the small space, a blanket pulled tight around him. Without thinking, she rose and added wood to the stove, then gently touched his shoulder. "Logan," she whispered, "this is ridiculous. You're going to be crippled by morning. The bed is big enough for both of us if we're sensible about it." In the dim light, she saw surprise in his eyes, followed by concern. "Are you sure, Tess? I'm sure I don't want to be responsible for you not being able to walk tomorrow," she replied practically. "Come on." They settled on opposite sides of the bed, a respectful distance between them, both fully clothed apart from boots and outer layers. Despite the innocence of the arrangement, Tess found her heart beating faster at his presence. It had been months since she'd shared a bed with anyone, and the sound of another person's breathing in the darkness brought both comfort and an unexpected ache of longing. "Tess," Logan's voice came softly through the darkness, "I want you to know I respect you in your grief." "I would never presume." "I know," she interrupted gently. "I trust you, Logan. I wouldn't have offered otherwise." The storm continued through the night and into the next day, keeping them confined to the cabin. They passed the time with conversation, reading aloud from Tess's new books, and preparing meals together. By the time evening arrived again, the awkwardness between them had melted away, replaced by a comfortable companionship that felt both new and somehow familiar. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, Logan reluctantly prepared to return to town. Standing at her door, he seemed to be struggling with words unusual for a man who generally spoke his mind plainly. "Tess, I've been thinking," he finally said. "The schoolhouse in town, it needs work, but nothing that couldn't be fixed before spring. If you were still interested in teaching, that is." She looked at him in surprise. "You've been thinking about the schoolhouse." "About a lot of things," he admitted. "Including that I've stayed in Willow Creek longer than I've stayed anywhere in years." "And why is that?" Tess asked, though something in her already knew the answer. Logan met her gaze directly. "I think you know why." The weeks that followed brought a change to their relationship. Logan continued to visit regularly, but there was a new awareness between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. In town, people had begun to notice. Tess overheard whispers when she went to buy supplies, some sympathetic, some judgmental. Widow Thornton and that drifter, moving on too quickly, disrespecting her husband's memory. The words stung more than she expected. One afternoon in early December, after a particularly difficult encounter with the disapproving wife of the general store owner, Tess found herself at James's grave in the small cemetery on the edge of town. "Am I betraying you?" she whispered, placing a small bunch of dried flowers against the wooden cross. "Is it wrong to feel this way when you've been gone such a short time?" Only the winter wind answered, cold against her tear-stained cheeks. That evening, when Logan arrived at her cabin, Tess was unusually quiet. He noticed immediately, his brow furrowing with concern. "What's troubling you?" he asked as they sat at her small table. Tess stared into her coffee cup. "People are talking about us. People always talk, Logan replied evenly. Does it bother you what they think? It shouldn't, she admitted. But it does. Not for my sake, but for James's memory, and for you. Logan reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. Tess, I need to be honest about something. I didn't just happen to pass through Willow Creek. I came here looking for work on the Henderson place. I'd heard about it from a man in Cheyenne. Tess looked up, surprised by this revelation. You never mentioned that. Because by the time I arrived, I learned the job had already been promised to someone else. I was planning to move on, but then. He paused. Then I saw you at church that first Sunday. You were sitting alone, wearing black, but something about the way you held yourself like you were broken but refusing to shatter completely, it made me want to know you. So you stayed because of me. Tess wasn't sure how to feel about this. I stayed because I found reasons to stay, Logan corrected gently. Getting to know you became the most important one. Tess stood abruptly, moving to the window. Logan, I don't know if I can give you what you want, what you deserve. What do you think I want? She turned to face him. A whole heart, not one that's still half buried with another man. Logan rose and crossed to her, stopping at her respectful distance. Tess, I've never expected you to forget James or to stop loving him. That's not how the heart works. Then what do you expect? Nothing, he said simply. I just want to be here for as long as you'll let me. Tess felt tears welling in her eyes. I visited his grave today. I felt like I was asking his permission, which is foolish because it's not foolish, Logan interrupted gently. When I'm with you, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I feel alive again, and then I feel guilty for feeling alive when he's gone. Logan took a careful step closer. May I tell you something my mother told me after my father died? She said grief is just love with nowhere to go. But eventually, you find places to redirect that love into memories, into other people, into the life you keep living because that's what the person you lost would want for you. Tess looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Logan agreed with a sad smile. I think she would have liked you very much. Something broke open inside Tess, then not the dam of grief, which had already cracked months ago, but a different barrier, one she had built to protect herself from feeling too much too soon. Logan, she said, her voice steadier now, I care for you more than I thought possible, but I need you to understand something. He waited, patient as always. My heart belongs to a dead man, she said simply. Part of it always will. Logan reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. I know, he said softly, and I'll carry it until you're ready, whether that's a month from now, a year, or never at all. The tenderness in his voice undid her completely. Tess stepped forward into his embrace, feeling his arms close around her, not demanding, just supporting. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I'm not asking you to forget, Logan murmured against her hair. Just to remember that you're still here, still living. They stood like that for a long moment, the winter light fading outside the window, casting the cabin in soft shadows. When Tess finally lifted her head to look at him, there was a new resolve in her eyes. Will you help me with the schoolhouse? She asked. Logan smiled, understanding all she wasn't saying. First thing tomorrow. As winter settled fully over Willow Creek, Logan and Tess fell into a new routine. Mornings were spent working on the abandoned schoolhouse in town, clearing debris, repairing windows, rebuilding desks. Afternoons, Logan would help with chores at Tess's ranch before they shared supper and evening conversations by the fire. The town gradually adjusted to seeing them together. Some, like Sheriff Burke and his wife, were openly supportive. Others maintained a polite distance. A few continued to disapprove, but their voices grew less important as December turned to January. And January to February, on Valentine's Day, Logan surprised Tess by arriving at her door with a small bundle of paper flowers he had crafted himself. Not much grows in February, he explained, a bit self-consciously, but I wanted to bring you something. Tess accepted the handmade bouquet with genuine delight. They're beautiful, Logan, and they'll last longer than real ones. That evening, after their meal, Logan seemed unusually thoughtful. When Tess asked what was on his mind, he hesitated before answering. I've been offered a job, he said finally. Foreman position on a ranch near Laramie. Good pay, permanent work. Tess felt her heart sink. That sounds like a fine opportunity. It would be, Logan agreed. But I told them I needed to discuss it with someone first. With me? Tess asked, surprised. Logan nodded. Tess, I've been thinking about what comes next, for me, for us if there is an us. He took a deep breath. I don't want to pressure you or rush you. I meant what I said about carrying your heart until you're ready. But I need to know if you think you might ever be ready. Because if there's no chance at all, then maybe I should take that job. Tess looked at him across the table, this man who had appeared in her life when she least expected it, and had shown her patience and kindness when she needed it most. The thought of him leaving created a physical ache in her chest that told her everything she needed to know. Don't take the job, she said quietly. Please. Hope flickered in Logan's eyes. Are you sure? Instead of answering with words, Tess rose from her chair and moved around the table. Slowly, giving him time to understand her intent, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his in a gentle, questioning kiss. Logan remained perfectly still for a moment, then stood, cupping her face in his hands as he returned the kiss with tender restraint. When they parted, his eyes searched hers. I don't want to replace him, he said softly. I just want a chance to build something new with you. I know, Tess replied, her hands resting lightly on his chest, and I'm ready to try. Their courtship progressed slowly through the remaining winter months. Logan continued to stay in town, though his visits to the ranch grew longer and more frequent. By early March, the schoolhouse renovations were complete enough for Tess to begin accepting students. The school board, persuaded largely by Sheriff Burke's influence, hired her officially, providing a small but steady income to supplement what the ranch produced. On the first day of spring, Logan took Tess riding to a hillside overlooking the valley. The snow had mostly melted, and the first green shoots were beginning to emerge from the earth. They spread a blanket on the ground and shared a simple picnic as the sun warmed the awakening land around them. I have something for you, Logan said as they finished their meal. From his pocket, he withdrew a small, worn leather pouch. Tess watched curiously as he opened it and tipped the contents into his palm, a simple gold band with a small pearl set into it. It was my mother's, he explained. The only thing of hers I kept all these years. Tess felt her breath catch as she understood what he was offering. Logan, let me say this first, he interrupted gently. Tess Thornton, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first evening by the creek. I know your heart will always hold a place for James, and I wouldn't want it any other way. But if you could find room in it for me too, I would consider myself the luckiest man alive. Tears filled Tess's eyes as she looked at this man who had waited so patiently, who had understood her grief without trying to diminish it, who had offered support without demanding anything in return. I've been thinking about something you said months ago, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. About grief being love with nowhere to go, you gave me somewhere to direct that love, Logan. You helped me remember how to live again. She reached out and closed his fingers around the ring. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you. Logan's face broke into a smile of such pure joy that Tess felt her heart swell in response. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a future neither of them had dared to imagine months before. They were married in April in a small ceremony at the newly reopened church. Sheriff Burke stood as Logan's best man, while the sheriff's wife Martha supported Tess. The townspeople came, even those who had whispered behind their hands months earlier. Something about seeing the couple together, the way Logan looked at Tess with such reverence, the way she smiled up at him with such clear affection, silenced even the most critical voices. After the ceremony, Tess insisted on visiting the cemetery before they began their married life. Logan waited respectfully at a distance as she knelt beside James's grave. I'll always love you, she whispered, touching the wooden cross gently. But I've found room in my heart for loving him too. I think you would approve of him, James. He's a good man. Different from you, but good in his own way. She placed a small bouquet of spring wildflowers against the marker, then rose and walked back to where Logan waited. He offered his arm, and together, they returned to the ranch, their ranch now, to begin their new life together. As the years passed, Willow Creek grew from a small settlement into a proper town. The railroad arrived in 1882, bringing new opportunities and residents. Tess continued teaching, eventually overseeing the construction of a larger school building as her original students grew older and new families arrived. Logan proved to be as talented with cattle as he was with carpentry. Under his management, their ranch expanded to include the Henderson property and became one of the most successful operations in the county. In 1883, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Emily James McKenzie, honoring both Logan's mother and Tess's first husband in a gesture that felt right to them both. 2 years later, a son joined their family, William Logan McKenzie, completing their household and bringing new joy to their lives on warm summer evenings. The family would often sit on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and purple. Tess would sometimes catch Logan looking at her with the same wonder he had shown on their wedding day, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "What are you thinking?" she asked him one such evening as their children played in the yard before bedtime. Logan smiled, taking her hand in his. "I was just remembering that day by the creek when you told me your heart belonged to a dead man, and you said you'd carry it until I was ready," Tess finished, squeezing his hand. "I would have waited forever," Logan said simply. Tess leaned against his shoulder, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I'm glad you didn't have to." As night fell over Willow Creek, Tess reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, the grief that had nearly broken her, the patience that had helped her heal, and the love that had given her a second chance at happiness. Her heart, once divided between past and present, had found its way to a future brighter than she could have imagined in those dark days after James's death. And Logan, the man who had promised to carry her heart until she was ready, now held it completely, not replacing what she had lost, but adding to what remained, proving that love was not a finite resource but an ever-expanding capacity for connection and joy.